we're going to the problem of evil. That is the first argument, the first one that we're considering. And I'll just go right into it. So there are two kind of broad, the problem of evil. So there are
for those of us who haven't heard of it, it sort of rings a bell. So maybe you can just refresh my memory as to what it is.
Right. So it's basically, if God exists and God is all good, all knowing, and all powerful, why is there so much evil in the world? It's kind of like spurred by that question. And there are really two broad families of arguments from evil. There is no single problem of evil. The first kind of family of arguments from evil is what philosophers call logical arguments from evil. And these try to show that God's existence is inconsistent with certain facts about evil and suffering. So it's like there couldn't possibly be a God given certain facts about evil and suffering. The second broad family of arguments from evil is what philosophers call evidential arguments from evil. And these basically just try to show that certain facts about evil or suffering are really good evidence against God's existence. They give us good reason to think that God exists. It's not so much that evil is inconsistent with God's existence, but they do give us good reason to think that God doesn't exist. So it's those two broad families of arguments, and maybe we could just start with logical arguments from evil.
Sure. So logical argument from evil, trying to actually exclude the possibility of God's existence given the nature of evil, and this will have something to do with a sort of logical incompatibility between the existence of evil and God. Why would the existence of God logically preclude the existence of evil? I think this would involve God necessarily being good, right? You'd need a picture of God that means that you can't have a God that isn't a good God, and you'd need to have an idea that there can't be a good God who would allow evil. Right, those are probably the 2 points of contention here.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it goes back at least to Epicurus, and then sort of revived by J.L. Mackie. And there are various different kind of more sophisticated logical arguments from evil nowadays, defended by philosophers like J.L. Schellenberg and James Sturba. But yeah, the basic idea from like Epicurus is that, well, if God exists, then he's going to be all-knowing, all-powerful, and perfectly good, and he's going to be essentially all of these. Since he's all-knowing, he's going to know about all the evil in the world, and he's going to know how bad it is and how to prevent it. Since he's all-powerful, he's able to prevent it. And since he's perfectly good, he's going to want to prevent it. And if a being knows about something, knows how to prevent it, is able to prevent it, and wants to prevent it, then it just follows that the being will prevent it. So then, if God exists, there's going to be no evil. It just follows from God's existence. But since there is evil, it just strictly follows that God doesn't exist. So God's existence is incompatible with the existence of evil.
QED sounds great. Now, like we'll discuss some of the objections, and hopefully we can keep things relatively brief because I want to get through as many of these as possible. Also, this is rather familiar territory for most people listening to this show. I want to say from the outset, though, this immediately strikes me as S tier, not necessarily because it's like the best argument in the world, but just because it's the problem of evil, man. This is like the atheist argument. It's like the first thing that people go to. It's the last thing that people sort of complain to about God. Probably if they made it to the pearly gates themselves and were still criticizing him, it would be either that or maybe the sort of not enough evidence would come in at a very, very close first or second. So I mean, what we didn't talk about was how we're going to actually rate this. So like S tier, A tier, B tier. We can talk about the strength of the argument. We can talk about historical relevance. We can talk about its persuasive power, even if it's not actually very good. In principle, it might happen to convince a lot of people. Based on those kinds of considerations, it kind of ticks all of the boxes for me so far to be like absolutely top tier. But I don't know. I don't know if you sort of agree with that initial intuition.
Yeah, it's difficult because like, how are we to rate these? Are we rating them in terms of plausibility, in terms of, strength, power to convince, ease with which it's communicated? I guess the way we did it for the theistic arguments was at least, generally speaking, how strong are they as arguments? Like, do they give us good reason in general to think that God exists or doesn't exist? And I think that's probably how we should rate these. And so,
sure.
I mean, we could probably, before we get into the rating, we should probably at least mention the evidential argument or arguments from evil, as well as like certain criticisms. So,
yeah, because some people will say that, like, I mean, the initial response to the logical problem of evil is to essentially say that, well, God can have good reasons to allow evil. There are lots of reasons why God might allow evil. God might need to allow evil because human free will is a valuable thing, and therefore, in order to have free will, people need to be able to freely choose to murder each other. C.S. Lewis talks about how if God were to were to still the triggers of every gun in World War One, preventing war from happening, it would seem to disallow the freedom of the soldiers to fire guns at each other. And as evil as that is, if you take that away, you sort of rid the world of something even worse than evil, which would be the mechanistic kind of no free will animals that they would become. So that's one famous reason. Another might be that evil is necessary to attain higher order goods. You can't have bravery if you don't have fear, so you need the bad thing to get the good thing. So lots of sort of reasons why God might allow some amount of evil, but also, as well as saying, okay, evil itself isn't logically incompatible with God, there are also people who say, I this is a big complicated topic, and I'm not convinced that it's logically incompatible with the existence of God, but I think it at least provides some kind of reason to sort of count against God's existence. So there's sort of a less strong version of the argument that just says that, and this is where we're in the evidential territory, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, for broadly the reasons that you've mentioned, philosophers have mostly turned away from logical arguments from evil, just because it seems like sure, God might want to prevent all evil, provided that evil isn't necessary for bringing about certain outweighing goods, and you identified some of those goods. But if certain instances of evil are indeed necessary for bringing about greater goods, then you can sort of see how God may very well want to allow that sorts of evil to exist. So for that reason, philosophers have turned to evidential arguments. There are lots of different evidential arguments. Probably my favorite, and probably your favorite, is a sort of argument from evolutionary animal suffering. And we can probably put it in Bayesian terms. I'm not going to go into the mathematics, right? So don't get scared. But basically, we're comparing different hypotheses about reality and seeing which one better predicts or better explains the data. And whichever one does better predict or better explain the data is supported by that data. So what is the data here? Well, it's basically that natural history has been pretty grotesque. For hundreds of millions of years, animals have been ripping each other to shreds. They've been preying on one another. They've been parasitizing one another. Natural disasters have ripped through entire species. Something like over 99% of all species that have ever existed are extinct. And just in general, starvation and misery and languishing seems to be kind of like the norm throughout evolutionary history. And given the bloodbath of evolutionary history, we can kind of ask, what best explains this? Well, one hypothesis is that there's this perfectly good being that orchestrated this from the get-go, that chose this as the very means by which this being is creating biological diversity in general and humans in particular. Another hypothesis is that no, like the foundation of reality, whatever it is, doesn't really care about the flourishing and languishing of creatures. And so if there's going to be a certain kind of evolutionary process, then it's not terribly surprising that it's going to be so fraught with profound and egregious suffering and things like that. And just to make this a bit more palpable for people, think about all the different ways that God could have created biological diversity in humans. He could have created it in 6,000 years, as young Earth creationists think he actually did. But no, he chose hundreds of millions of years of animals ripping each other to shreds. He could have made photosynthesizing animals that get their energy from the sun, instead of having to devour each other savagely in order to survive. But instead, no, he chose animals devouring each other savagely. He could have made animals chemosynthesize, so get their energy from chemicals. He could have made animals or biological organisms or whatever out of material that doesn't constantly get lost to the environment, so there is no need to kind of continually imbibe new materials. He could have given anesthetic in the claws and teeth of predators, so that the animals who are in their dying hours of misery aren't actually in misery. Instead, they get some sort of anesthetic effect from that. Could have altered this fawn's mental state so that the fawn doesn't experience that kind of excruciating agony, and so on. So I've just given so many different ways that God could have created biological diversity and humans. And it seems like we'd expect God to create through one of these ways, given that God is perfectly good. He knows exactly the extent of the suffering that would be caused by a grotesque and protracted evolutionary process. And so it seems like theism makes it incredibly surprising that we'd see this bloodbath of evolutionary history, whereas under a competing naturalistic hypothesis, as I've explained, it's not terribly surprising. And so this is some pretty powerful evidence for the naturalistic hypothesis over theism. So that's the general kind of line of argument here.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that if you assume that you've just sort of got organisms competing with each other for survival, and it's sort of unsupervised, it's not only a better explanation, but you would come to expect You don't just explain the abundance of suffering, you come to expect the abundance of suffering. And it's worth emphasizing that natural selection is the process by which we come about. And natural selection does not just involve, but relies upon the death and destruction of the weak. Survival of the fittest is the same thing as the death and destruction of the unfit. And this is the chosen mechanism. And like you say, that on the surface at least, seem to be many, many different ways that this could have been avoided. I mean, it is worth mentioning that what we expect to find kind of depends how far back you go in your assumptions. So, if we assume the existence of a bunch of organisms tearing each other apart, what best explains this, God or no God? Some will object, well, sure, okay, it's unlikely that animals would be savagely killing each other if God existed. However, if God didn't exist, it would be unlikely that anything, including animals, existed at all. So if you're going to play the game of sort of, well, what would you expect if there was no God? Oh, you'd expect an entire universe with planets and animals that sort of come to life and have, first-person centers of consciousness and eat, and none of that's in any way likely if there's no God. So some people will just want to push that assumption back and say that the very fact that you're talking about animals that can suffer is itself reason to believe in God. That does sort of move it to a different argument, because now we're talking about an argument for God's existence from the existence of animals. But it is sort of interlinked. And it's also worth pointing out that people do say one of the arguments for God's existence is the moral argument, that objective moral standards can only exist if God exists. And so if you're looking at the world and saying, oh, this is wrong, I don't like this is bad, all of this suffering, boo, people like to say, well, by what standard are you judging the world to be bad? And if there's some kind of moral standard by which things are bad, then you're assuming the existence of God. Therefore, you are, in the words of Frank Turek, stealing from God in order to make your case against his existence. What do you think of that?
Yeah, so basically everything is wrong with that. So firstly, in terms of the data, we don't have to construe the data in terms of evil or something like that. All we have to construe the data is a protracted process of profound suffering. And then we can, that does not commit the person who's running this argument to there being objective evil. It doesn't commit them to an objective moral standard. Instead, we're just using the descriptive state of affairs of there being a very protracted process of grotesque, overwhelming, seemingly gratuitous suffering, seemingly pointless suffering. So once you do that, then we can just compare how likely this data is under the respective hypotheses, and we don't need to commit ourselves to there being objective evil or something like that. So no, you don't need to run the problem of evil, or you don't need to be committed to there being objective morality by running the problem of evil. That's one thing to say. The second thing to say is you can always sort of run this kind of point, even if you were to put it in terms of evil and objective evil, you could always put it in terms of an internal critique. So the theist themselves, the theist is committed to there being objective evil. The theist is committed to thinking that these instances of suffering are evil. And it's an internal problem for them then, if they're positing this omnibenevolent God who orchestrated this process, that he would create it in ways that are rife with this kind of evil. Evil, in fact, seems to be the very engine, the very mechanism of creation. So the argument then doesn't need to be run in terms of saying something like, oh, hey, this really is objectively evil, and that shows that God doesn't exist. You can say, no, you theist, you believe that this is objectively evil, and so you have a problem on your hands. I don't need to say that it's objectively evil. That's the second thing. That's a second response. And then a third response, there are actually many more, but I'll just give this for the sake of time. The third response is that not only do Turek and proponents of these arguments typically merely assert that objective morality requires God's existence. Typically, they don't give adequate justification for this, at least by my lights. But also, there are countless models that are perfectly consistent, defended by professional ethicists, countless consistent models of how you can have objective morality under a non-theistic worldview. So people can check out my channel for various videos that I've done on that, but we don't need to get into that here. But suffice it to note
I think basically everything we say should be footnoted with at least 10 different videos that you've made, and probably an article in a journal somewhere as well. I'll make sure the relevant stuff is linked down in the description. But you're right. I'm not sure if I think I interrupted you there. I'm not sure if you had anything else that you wanted to
No, that's all good. I mean, we can cover objections all day long and talk about these sorts of things, but we should probably get into ranking.
Yeah, we're here for the ranking, man.
I know you suggested S tier.
Yeah, talking about it now, it's definitely got to be at least A, right? I think it's probably S tier, like I say, just because it's an absolute it's an absolute classic. I mean, it would be rediscovered by any person who ever thought about the existence of a good God. There is the problem that it assumes God has to be good. It doesn't really do anything. I mean, you said earlier that we're not arguing against any particular religious tradition. There are religious traditions that believe in a sort of deistic, non-personal God that this doesn't really do anything for, which makes me maybe want to bump it down to A, but it's got to be one of those, surely, right? I'm not sure. Maybe it's just too good.
I would vote S tier because, like, again, it's the problem of evil. Like, if that doesn't get S tier, then what else is going to get S tier? And lots of professional philosophers defend this, and it does really have, I think, sway with people, and it's got some high degree of plausibility.
Cool, right. Problem of evil is going in the S tier. I'm writing this down just so I can keep track of where we are. And we'll put it on screen. But for those listening, hopefully you can just keep track. So Problem of Evil is S tier, probably not a huge surprise to anybody, and probably not super interesting to anyone who's watched even like 2 minutes of any video I've ever made in the history of my YouTube channel. So let's briskly move on.